Hello, this is Adam O, and welcome back to part 3, which is the final part to how to draw Pasadena City Hall. For all of you who had the unbearable, overwhelming urge to draw Pasadena City Hall. If that is your flavor of insanity, you're definitely in the right place. So we're going to be doing some skipping over this. In part 1, we learned how to do the wing. In part 2, we learned how to do that upper dome. And in this part, we're going to finish out the face, and we're going to stop on the most important parts. And we're going to kind of speed through we're not going to kind of speed through, we're going to speed through all the parts that we don't really need to spend effort on because we've already taught how to do that. So I'm slowing down for this part in this archway because the archway is see-through, and we're going to have to do some layer work here. So this part is black, but it's not jet black. So what I'm doing is I have put a layer of mid-tone gray using just a blending stump over this entire area. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over this several times with increasing degrees of blackness. So what I've got is a scrap piece of paper over to my left. And I've scrubbed in a whole bunch, like a big blob of extra soft charcoal on that scrap paper. Then I just rub the blending stump in that and then use this blending stump like it was a pencil. So what I'm doing is building up layers of blackness, making sure that the black is darker on the corners and on the sides than it is in the middle, because these parts are gaining more shadow, or they hold more shadow than the middle. And it's just the way the light kind of reflects and refracts and bounces off of different things. And so I'm taking my time here. In the face of this building, I'm going to take my time on so many areas because this is a man-made object, and which means that if I'm off even just a little bit on some of these details, it's going to look sloppy and drawn. And we don't want that. We want it to look like a building, which is, all the poles are straight and all that. Now, let me address this little archway first, and then I'll get into what I was going to talk about. So the archway is the one that I think is in the far back, and it has shadows along the sides and then gets brighter in the middle. So I'm doing the same thing there that I was doing on the main ceiling part of this, or the inside wall part of this, where I'm just taking my time and going over each little section and building up layers of gray and black. Then I'm just going to go back in with a Tombow eraser and clean up the edges. When I say clean up the edges, I mean any overlap that I have that's kind of outside the lines, I just erase those away in order to make a sharp edge. So let me address the style that I was going to talk about a second ago. I do a style that I call dirty realism. So the idea is that from 10 feet or more away, the drawing should look pretty photographic. It's not going to look perfect. It's not hyper-realism, but it's going to look like a photograph. As you close in on the drawing, you're going to see all the little flaws and imperfections and pencil marks and all that. That's the dirty part of the dirty realism. For that reason, because this is my style that I use in all my drawings, I don't use a straight edge whenever I'm drawing the bulk of this. I used a straight edge in the first video to make sure that the roof was lined up correctly, that it was even on both sides, and then I used one to do the same thing with that little stripe that goes across the face of those wings. Otherwise, all this is just drawn by hand. I can't teach you how to do that. You just have to practice with it. But that's the style that I use because I want this to look photographic, but I also want people to see the handwork that went into this. So that's why I call it dirty realism. It's realism, but it still looks drawn. So right now I'm working on a little stripe or a little strip of ridges that happens inside this archway. And all I'm doing here is picking out the parts that are a little bit darker than the rest, and I'm very lightly drawing that in with hard charcoal, and then I'll blend that away with a blending stump. So we've gotten past, we're doing this in layers, the way I talk about in all my videos. I put in the base layer with a blending stump, and I get all those shades and tones the way I want them. Then I go back in with something sharper and more defined, like a pencil, and I start adding details. If we have shadows that need to go pitch black, I'll switch to extra soft charcoal and put those in with that. But the point is that we are building up layers the same way we do in a painting. We put the basic idea, then we refine it and add more details, and then we refine it and correct things like the side of this little archway is not perfectly straight, so I'll be refining that. We'll refine things like brightness and darkness, and each time we go over something like this, we make it just a little bit more realistic. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm going over this and taking my time. I'm dropping in the darker shadows and little details with pencil, then I'll blend those away with a blending stump in order to remove pencil marks. Now I'm going back in with a Tombow eraser and just cleaning up that edge in order to make that, as perfectly straight as I can. And now we're going to go back in with, this is hard charcoal, but it's the darkest of my hard charcoal pencils. I explained this in another video. I suppose I can explain it here too. No two hard charcoal pencils are the same. Some of them are going to be darker, more like a medium pencil. Some of them are going to be really, really light. And so if you've got more than one hard charcoal pencil, always test those out on scrap paper first. This particular one that I have operates more like a medium pencil. It's darker than normal hard charcoal. So I'm putting in some darker shadows using that, and using that kind of imperfection to my advantage. So when I say imperfection, it should be hard charcoal, but it actually is more like medium, and that's kind of an imperfection in the production of a pencil like that. So anyway, we're going back over this with a Q-tip and just blending that out as smoothly as humanly possible so that we remove all pencil marks. Then I'm going to go above this arch and I'm going to start laying in some of these base really light gray areas. And how I'm doing this is I've used enough of this blending stump to where the charcoal has started to be removed from the tip of it because the paper's pulling it off. But there's still enough on it to where I can make a light gray tone with the blending, with the charcoal that's still left on the blending stump. So I'm just using that to my advantage and laying in just the lightest, smoothest gray above this little archway. Now I'm going to reload that with some more extra soft charcoal just to put a little bit more darkness on this. Now I can start laying in these little, I think they're like shadow-like reflections. There are often times that I'll be doing something like this and I won't actually know what it is that I'm drawing because I don't look, for instance, I don't look at this as an entire building whenever I'm drawing it. I'm looking at like a 1-inch section of the drawing and just drawing that. So oftentimes I'll do a huge landscape and I'll spend, I don't know, an hour working on this little 1-inch section of the drawing and taking so much time and focusing so much on that one little 1-inch area that I don't notice that what I was drawing was a turtle that was in the background or a mushroom or whatever that was on the in the woods. Because all I'm really focusing on are the shapes of the shadows and the depth of those shadows, sometimes I don't actually know what it is I'm drawing as an object until I'm completely done with the drawing. So right here, all I'm looking at on my reference photo is that this archway has a couple of these shadows and stuff that are just little strips of almost like a Nike swoosh type of, like an upside down Nike swoosh kind of a shadow. And that's all I'm seeing. I'm not seeing an archway. I'm not seeing decoration or anything like that. I'm just looking at the shadows and trying to reproduce those as best I can. Then, just like with all the other parts of this, the face of this building, I'll grab a Tombow eraser and clean up the edges on any part that needs to be sharp. I'm going to do that same method. From here, I'm just going to adjust the levels of darkness and start working on this entire archway and just adjusting little bits at a time. And all I'm thinking while I'm doing this is this part needs to be darker, this part needs to be lighter, let's adjust this, let's adjust that. So we blast through that. Now let's get to one of the things that's going to make this really, really stand out and start looking realistic. And that is there are two poles or columns or whatever you want to call them on each side of this archway. And these are so easy to make, but they look like they just took forever. So all I'm doing is I'm going to drop in a shadow in between those two poles on the left-hand side with a blending stump, but I want to make that fairly dark. In fact, I may even darken it up even more with pencil later. But for right now, I'm starting light and working my way to darkness. And I'm just going to draw a straight line with a blending stump and then just quickly grab a Tombow eraser and zip down the right-hand edge of this in order to clean up the edges and make that line straight so it doesn't fade out. It's got a defined edge on it. And I'm going to do this with every pole on the entire face of this whole building. I want to do this basically the same way. Now, sometimes I won't use a blending stump. Sometimes I'll use a pencil to do the same thing, but the technique is exactly the same. I'll lay in the shadows between the two poles, clean up the edges, and then I'll start working on the poles themselves. Now, the one on the left here, I'm going to do the same thing. There's a shadow that comes off of it. And in fact, this one may be where the building starts to wrap around to where we get kind of a, I think it's a hexagonal shape. But yeah, there's going to be corners on each of these and then poles on the edges of those corners. So I'm just going to drop a shadow on the left-hand pole too, and I'll clean it up the same way here in a minute. And then that gives me the most basic starting edge of each of those, and then I can start refining them and turn them into cylindrical shapes here in just a minute. And I'll just do that over time. This drawing is really tricky because there's a lot of areas, especially like this, where if you get them wrong by even a millimeter or two, it's going to mess up the drawing. But there's also, I think more importantly, the thing that can psychologically trip you out and kind of, what's the phrase I'm looking for? It kind of intimidate you, is what I'm doing now looks so simple compared to all the details in the rest of the drawing that I kind of become afraid that it's going to look too simple and make it look bad by comparison. So in other words, comparing these poles to what I've already drawn makes what I'm drawing look terrible. And so it can be a little bit intimidating because I've got so much of this drawing done already, I don't want to mess up the piece. The only way to get past that is to just start drawing and trust that you have the skill level to do it, and trust that you have the ability to correct mistakes. So what I did a second ago is I just zipped down my blending stump on the left-hand side of each of these poles very lightly to add in just kind of a gradient shadow on the left-hand sides of each of these poles. And now I'm drawing in, I'm going to put this in air quotes, quote-unquote details up at the top of these posts where you've got this decorative kind of, I don't know the word for it, it's kind of like a base of the balcony above it, but it's like this decorative top to both of these poles. And it's got a lot of intricate details, but we're so far away from the building that we can cheat those details by just drawing in just literal dots. These represent the shadows of a lot of these decorative carved markings. And we don't have to get super detailed in this because we're going to trick the person who's looking at the drawing into thinking there's a lot of detail because they're going to compare what they're seeing there to other flat parts of the building. And by comparison, psychologically, it's going to look detailed. You can't do this in every drawing, but in this particular one, we can pull it off. So once I have those in place, just very, very lightly, I'm not putting a ton of pressure on it. I'm going to just zip down the left-hand edges of each of these poles and make a darker line. Now, it's really important here. This is kind of hard to explain. You don't want a line that's so defined that it looks like I drew a line, like a comic book or cartoon type of line. You just want a darker strip along that edge so that it looks like the shadow gets darker as it hugs the pole. And we'll end up going back over this with a blending stump and blending that in to where we can take out that hand-drawn line. But we do need it to be darker the closer it gets to the pole, because that shows the viewer that the pole wraps around and is cylindrical. The outside shadow is oftentimes more important than the surface shadow of the pole. Then I'm just going to jump back up into this little decorative topper that's on top of both of these. And I'm just laying that in with a B graphite pencil, which is really rare for me to use. I normally don't use graphite on my charcoal drawings. But the decorative elements up here are so thin that I can't really do them with a blending stump. It's easier for me to lay those in with a B graphite pencil and then blend those out, those pencil marks, with a blending stump. And so this is super, super fine detailed work. And it's extremely difficult to do, especially since I'm not using a straight edge. It takes a steady hand to do this. See, a lot of the times I do landscape type drawings, which are way more complex than anything else that I draw. But I have more leeway in that because I'm drawing something that was created by nature, which is more chaotic. And so if I get a leaf wrong, or I get, a tree stump that's off by a millimeter or two, it doesn't matter. Nobody's going to look at that and go, well, that doesn't look right. But a building is so precise on its measurements that you have to get those correct. So anyway, I am cleaning up or not cleaning up, but I'm finishing up the last of these little details that happen along the tops of these poles and along that decorative little piece. And I'm being finicky with it because we don't have to get it exact, but we need to get it at least somewhat uniform. And then I'm going to skip up, and there's a secondary little decorative piece that happens behind that. Most of these little decorative areas like this will have a secondary and sometimes even a third little decorative element that happens in layers. And now, fortunately, it doesn't take much to draw them because we can only see a tiny little sliver. The difficult part about this is making sure that they look offset and that they look like separate entities. Otherwise, they'll blend together and just look like one big giant blob, and it'll be difficult to tell that those are the details that create the look of this building. So all I'm doing is I'm going to lay all that stuff in quickly with a pencil, and then I'll just blend. I'm blending the pencil marks together to take out, the actual pencil marks, but I'm also laying in a thin layer of shadow. And so I'm kind of killing two birds with one stone here with a blending stump. I'll go back in and add some darker, extra soft charcoal to this area, and then I wipe that off on scrap paper so that it's not jet black. And then I'm going to start working on a shadow that comes from the posts that exist on the right-hand side of that archway. This whole area drops a little triangular type shadow along the left-hand side of those posts. So I'm just going to drop those in with a blending stump, and we will go darken these up later. The main thing that I'm worried about here on this section is shape. I don't need the shadows themselves to be the perfect tone of gray just yet, because that's something we can refine later. What I do with the Tombow eraser in this area is I'm barely touching the paper, but I'm erasing away maybe 20% of this shadow in the areas where these stripes exist. That way it looks like the shadows there are going to be a little bit brighter than the shadows that happen under each one of these little ridges, if that makes sense. So I need to have a little bit of lightness in there to show that it's got texture. Now I'll jump back into the top elements of this again. and do the same thing here that I was doing on the left-hand posts. I'm just going to throw in the details, draw in the stripes. This is all the same stuff that we just did on the left-hand side. I'm just repeating that on the right. So once I get that in, I'm just going to bounce back over to the left-hand side, and I'm going to start smoothing out the shadows of these posts. And then I'm going to start working on some shadows that happen along the left-hand side of this hexagonal shape, which is basically just the area that wraps around on the left-hand side. I'm going to start defining some of those shadows, or not defining, but laying in the base of some of these shadows. And we're going to start building our way to the left and getting more of an idea of how to define and clarify these two little poles that I just started to draw. This is the amazing part to me. This is the fun part, because when my hand gets out of the way here in a minute, look at those poles that I've got there, and look how messy those things are. They just look like blobs of nothing, even though we spent so much time on them. Those things are going to come to life here in just a few minutes and be something totally different than what they are right now. They'll be a lot cleaner too once I get this whole area added in. So real light with a B graphite pencil, I'm doing the same thing here where the face of this building has a lot of ridges and a lot of like framework that sticks out further than the face of the building. Each one of those has its own shadow, but those shadows are extremely light, so it's easier for me to add that in with graphite and then define it later. So all I've done is I've defined the edges of the shadow on the left with a graphite pencil, and that butts right up against one of those little decorative pieces of framework on the outside. I know that's not going to make a lot of sense right now, but once I get that laid in place, it'll be one of those, oh, I see what he's talking about moments. So all I've done is I've sharpened the edge of that shadow, and when I draw with the pencil itself, I'm not really drawing a line along the edge of the shadow. It should never look like an outline. I'm using just enough pressure to where the outside line that I'm drawing is the same exact tone and shade as the shadow itself. So all we're doing is sharpening up the edge and not making an outline around the shadow. That line that I drew along the edge of the shadow should be the same tone and shade as the shadow itself, so that the line just disappears. So I'm going to jump into that left-hand side like I was talking about before, and all I'm going to do is start doing a very light outline along each of the major elements that happen within this section. So there's some framework that happens there. There's a couple poles that are in this area. There's another arch doorway in this area. There's a little bit of decorative elements here and there, and there's all kinds of little bumps and ridges and stuff like that. The reason that I can get away with outlining that stuff with a B pencil in that area is because this entire left-hand side is saturated in shadow. And so the outlines that I'm making, I'm not getting super dark with them because I know they're going to kind of disappear whenever I add shadow along this entire left-hand section. I'm just going to start dropping those in. Let's blast through this because this is just an outline. There's not much I can teach you there. It's just I'm outlining the window that happens in this area, all the little things like the archways and stuff like that. Then once I get that in place, I'm going to jump up into that top window and drop in pitch black extra soft charcoal, and then I'm going to blend that in with a blending stump. I don't care if I go outside the lines here because I'll be cleaning this up with a Tombow eraser just like every section of the drawing. Now I try to stay within the lines, but if I go outside of them, it's not a big deal. Once you erase away those overlaps, this will look perfectly sharp and like a perfect square. Then we're going to go from the inside corners of the window, and we're going to pull inward because the shadows that happen along that corner are darker than the middle. And so if you just make a little flicking motion from where those corners meet, it'll automatically make it darker where you start the mark and lighter where you end the mark. This is the inside kind of framework of the window. I'll do the same thing along the left-hand side. I'll start in that corner and just kind of pull. And that way the middle parts of the window framework, I keep calling it a framework, but it's not. It's basically like a cutout. The middle parts of those are just slightly lighter than the corners. That gradient's real important. It's what makes that look 3D. If I had that just a flat gray tone, it's going to look too flat and it's going to look too two-dimensional. Then lightly, barely touching the paper, I'm taking the hardest of my hard charcoal pencils, which is barely, it makes a really light gray mark, and laying in the outside decorative sort of framework of this window. This happens on the outside of the window, and it's more like little indents than anything. But I lay those in the same way. Make a mark, blend out the pencil marks themselves, then clean it up with a Tombow eraser. Same pattern. Every element of this building is going to be done that way. Now, this is one of those sections that it can intimidate people. I mean, this entire drawing can intimidate people because it is extremely complex. Of all the commissions I've ever done, this is the most complex commission. But this particular section, this is when we're getting into details along those banisters, and we're also doing decorative lines and stripes that happen along the top edge of the building. And so I guess my advice here would be, when you're this far away from the building, don't try to get too detailed. If you try to draw these little microscopic swirls and decorative elements that happen in these little sections, you're going to overdo it, and it's not going to look detailed. It's going to look crowded and clumpy. So I pick out the strongest of the shadows that happen in these little decorative places, and I do those and eliminate the tiny details that have like mid-tone grays or whatever, because it makes those decorative elements pop out more and they become more interesting. It makes them look a little bit higher contrast. Then, using the lightest touch humanly possible with hard charcoal, I'm laying in an extremely light shadow along the left-hand side, and this is where there's another two poles that happen right at the corners of this building. And the reason I'm being light is because even though there are shadows in this area, the shadows that happen along those poles are slightly darker than that area, and it's a real finicky, subtle shadow. I'd rather start light and then darken it up if it needs to be darkened, rather than going too dark and then needing to erase away marks. It's always better in charcoal to work from light to dark first, at least on something like this. There are drawings I do where I go extremely dark right off the bat, but that's more of a confidence in your skill thing than it is good technique. I'm just going to finish off this pole with a blending stump, which is just a really light stroke, just enough to separate that pole's shade from the sky. So once I've got all that in place, I'm just going to grab a blending stump and start adding in some shadows along this curvy type edge that happens along the top left-hand section. There are some stripes that happen there. There's some decorative elements. But the big overall thing in this area is that the overall decorative elements in this section create a more unified shadow. Like if there are 3 or 4 stripes of decorative stuff that happen along the top, those all group together to create one larger stripe. And so I need the shadows along those stripes as a whole to be consistent. So I just quickly threw in a shadow that's darker on the sides, a little lighter in the middle, and then I can worry about defining the stripes within those with a pencil a little bit later. So quickly, I want to drop in all the other decorative elements, the poles and whatnot, the same exact way that we just did. So there's not like a bunch to teach here. I'm just doing more of the same. So we're just going to blow through that really quickly. And then we'll slow down whenever we start to work on, there's the shadow that happens along the entire left-hand side of this section. But there are also darker shadows that happen within that. And so this is where things get complex, because I need to look at this two different ways. I need to look at it as the side of a building, one single giant unified piece. I also have to look at every individual piece that happens within that. So there are going to be some parts where, like, a pole is going to cast a darker shadow than the shadow it exists within, if that makes sense. Then there's going to be decorative elements that cast their own shadows within the overall shadow. So it's never going to be a case where you're going to have one shadowed tone that just takes care of the whole side of the building. This is where you need to have an eye for detail, because there are probably half a dozen different shades of gray in this section, and sometimes picking those out from each other is the most difficult part of an entire drawing when you get this detailed. So that's what I'm doing. I'm laying in a base shadow that covers this whole section, and then while I'm at it, I'm also picking out some sections that have darker shadows within those and darkening those up, and this is all base layers. I will go back in and refine this a couple more times before it's done, but by the time I'm done with this section, it will transform dramatically. Right now, it's the same thing as those poles. It looks messy and clunky, but here in just a few minutes, it doesn't take all that long to do it. This will start to come to life and become really realistic compared to what it is right now. And each step of this, every time I add a shadow, every time I add a new shape, I'm cleaning that up with my Tombow eraser. If you don't have a Tombow eraser, I would consider getting one. They are cheap as all get out. If you just refuse for whatever reason to buy a Tombow, or you don't have access to it, you can do the same thing that I'm doing right here with a kneaded eraser. It's just a little bit more finicky to get that to work. You have to have a really sharp edge on your kneaded eraser, a really sharp point, and then you have to worry about it bending while you're erasing away these edges. And then once it loads itself up with charcoal or graphite as you erase, you have to pull it out and clean it by pulling and kneading it and make a new point. The Tombow it's so much easier to use. But you can use a kneaded eraser if you don't have access to a Tombow. Now grabbing hard charcoal, and again, this is the harder of the two. No, this is the harder of the two, the light hard charcoal. I'm defining some of the edges and the details that happen around doorways and windows and stuff like that. And again, I'm barely touching the paper because I'm not drawing an outline here. I'm drawing a very thin shadow that doesn't have an extremely sharp defined edge on it. When you do that, you can use the flattest part of the pencil, and you can use a very light touch and just start adding those things in little bits at a time. And while I'm at it, I will straighten out the archways, I'll straighten out the edges of the window and make those sharper. I'll add darker shadows where they need to be added, and we're starting to go into our first major layer of refinement using this pencil. Watch as I lay these in along the edges of this tiny little window up here. It'll start to look more and more 3D, and it'll start to look more realistic as I define those edges. Now I'll do the same thing with every part of this. I'll do it with the poles. I'll do it with the archway, doorway thing. There are little decorative elements that happen around each of these windows. I'll do those. The stripes that happen along the top, if those need defined, I'll just lightly define those. The key here is a light touch, and the key beyond that is to make sure that your strokes are very straight and very deliberate. This is not an area where you want to get wavy lines or lines that aren't parallel. Now there's a balcony that happens underneath this little archway, and it's got these little poles and posts. At least I think, yeah. Those are real easy to draw. I'm just drawing just vertical lines, and that's it. There's no detail to that whatsoever. But once I get all this stuff blended together, that will pop out and look like a balcony that's got little posts and a little railing and all that. But there's no detail put into that. It's literally just a sideways hyphen. It's just a vertical slash mark to make those posts come out. The posts appear because I've left negative space in between each of those. Right now it doesn't look super detailed, but in just a minute when I start refining all this, all of a sudden that balcony and railing will appear. You always have to look several steps ahead when you're doing a drawing this complex, because in a lot of drawings, if you mess up, you can correct the mistakes. In this one, we're trying to prevent as many mistakes as humanly possible, because the corrections in a drawing like this are really difficult to pull off. If the drawing is this precise, the corrections of mistakes will also require a massive amount of precision to pull off. So when you have to erase things away, the erasure marks that you make have to be really, really on target. Because if you erase too far, you're going to get into a part that does look good and mess it up, and it's just a mess. So this one is all about precision and trying to get things right the first time. This is not a drawing that I would suggest like a beginner try out. Not unless they're willing to make a ton of mistakes and learn from those mistakes, because as a teaching tool, I would absolutely tell people, yeah, do this. I don't care if you can't draw a stick man. Try to draw this building. Like, go crazy with it and see how close you can get to the real thing, because that's the way I think whenever I do the majority of my pieces. If a drawing scares me, the idea of drawing a specific thing scares me, I know I'm on the right track. Because I already know my skill set with portraits and pets and, buildings, and there goes my phone. Of course, it only goes off when I'm recording. Anyway, I already know my skill set, and so I know what I can do and what I can't do. The whole thing is I try to identify the things I can't do and learn those things. This building is one of those that made me think, man, I don't know. And so I knew I was on the right track whenever somebody came to me with that commission and said, can you do it? And my reaction is absolutely. It still scared me, but, Okay, so here's where some of this is going to start popping out and coming to life. There's a very, very light gray that happens on the face of this building that doesn't happen on the poles. The poles catch way more light, so they're more of a bright white, whereas the face of this building, the middle section, has just a tiny little gray background area to it. And if I get that just right, it's pretty subtle, but if I get that just right, those poles will pop forward and they'll start to look more like cylinders. And we'll define those here in just a little bit to make them look more and more like cylinders and make them look more and more realistic. But the very first layer of that's coming together as I add in this little light gray background to the face of this building. It's going to start pushing things forward and pulling other things backward. And the key here is subtlety. I don't want to get this too dark in this area. So if there's any tip that I can give you, or let's say the biggest tip I could give you here, give me a second on that, because we're going to darken up the left-hand side of the shadows on the poles a tiny bit, and I mean a tiny, tiny bit, just enough to show that they're there. That's just a light stroke with a semi-dirty blending stuff just to show that there's a shadow on the left-hand side that makes it look like it rolls around to the left. So the biggest tip I can give you on doing a drawing like this is Never put enough pressure on your pencils to make an indent in the paper. There's always going to be some indent because you're going to have to put some pressure on there. But everything should be fairly light. And if you're ever pushing so hard on the paper that you can see what you're drawing on the piece of paper that's under it, then you're pushing too hard. And that's what's going to make your stuff look, it's one of the things that'll make your stuff not look realistic. Because you're destroying the teeth of the paper at that point, it's going to make it look shiny in those edges because there's no little bumps to help break up the light reflection that happens on paper. I'll explain that in another video that's a little sciencey. But the whole thing is you should always use a light touch when you're doing stuff like this, and then dedicate yourself to darkening it further whenever you get into refinement by using a darker pencil. Rather than like, it's sometimes tempting just to, if you're drawing with hard charcoal and you need to darken an area, just to put a ton of pressure on it and using that to make it blacker. It just destroys the paper. It looks unrealistic. You're never going to get rid of all the pencil marks when you do that. So light is always better, and then make it darker by using darker pencils. Now we'll just clean up the edges of each of these poles on the left-hand side using, I'm using hard charcoal, and I'm barely touching the paper because I don't want that to look like I've drawn an outline there. It needs to be about the same shade of gray as the shadows that exist around it, so that it blends right in and it doesn't leave a defined outline type of a mark. And I'll do the same thing on the edges of this building. And then we're just kind of cleaning up and sharpening all these tiny little ridge-like details that happen all throughout these little decorative elements. Notice what I didn't do was go whole hog here and do all the details right off the bat and then fill in the shadows around it. I'm building up layer after layer after layer and refining each time I go over it. It takes a long time to do that, but most, like the average artist, won't take the time to do that, which is why their drawings don't look realistic. They try to go the impatient route, and a drawing like this is 100% patience. So that while I've got that in there and I'm defining these details, I'm just going to go back and sharpen up a lot of these little ridges. Because again, whenever I put them in the first time, I needed them to just exist. I needed them to be there. And then we can refine those and sharpen the edges and make them straighter and more defined as we start refining detail. Again, super light touch. I'm just darkening this a little bit at a time until it gets to where I want it. I go light, and then I'm thinking, it needs to be darker, so I'll put another layer, using the same amount of pressure pretty much. I'm just building up little layers of charcoal over the top of each other each time I go across this. I'm mainly concentrating on the edges of these stripes because I don't want an area that's got a lot of overlapping strokes, meaning that I'm coloring inside the lines the way you would as a 5-year-old in a coloring book. So I'm just shading inside the lines here and making sure the outside line is really sharp and really crisp, and there's no little pencil marks that go outside of that. And I'll do this all the way across the building. It barely looks like I'm doing anything here, right? But look how much, look at this as an overall thing now, rather than just the things that we were drawing individually. And look how much this has changed over the course of the last 20 minutes or so. So we're going to go into the little balcony and railing that happens within this archway, and I'm just putting a very light shadow along the underside of that railing using circular motions. We don't have to get super detailed there at all. We just need that line to exist but not look like a single drawn cartoony line. That's why I'm using circles there. So now we're going to drop in the simplest parts of this, which there's a little silhouette of a pole in the background or a decorative spire type thing. And then there's some more spires in front of it, and we're doing the reason I'm going fast through this is because I'm doing here exactly what I did with all the rest of this drawing. I'm just doing more of the same. First, I'm going to go back into some of these shadows that happen along the right hand side of this archway and start to darken those a little bit and make those a little bit more defined. And that will make these poles pop forward just like we did on the left hand side. So I'm making sure that the majority of the dark marks that I make here get darker as we go toward the pole, as we get to the inside of that pole. Once I add that level of darkness, I'm going to go back in with a Tombow eraser and sharpen up the edges of these. Now, shadows operate differently depending on where the sun is. This is a bright, what appears like a summer day, and it looks like it's not quite noon, but it's enough to where the shadows aren't long. And so these shadows are going to have a lot more defined edges than what you would get at, say, like, dusk or early morning. When you get that early or that late in the day, the shadows will be way more elongated, and the ends of them will fade out, and they'll have more of a gradient along the edges. The closer you get to noon and the brighter the sun is, the more those shadows will have like a really sharp defined edge to them. And that's what's happening in this drawing. And I think it's one of the things that makes this stand out as a really interesting point is that the shadows become their own things, their own points of interest. So I'm sharpening those up with a Tombow eraser. I'm making little corrections along the outside border of the archway itself. And I'm making sure that there's plenty of contrast between that shadow and the face of the building that lies behind it. Then just like before, I'll go along the decorative border of the outside of that archway, and with a B graphite pencil, I'm just sharpening up that edge in a way that doesn't make an actual hardcore outline. I know I keep mentioning that a lot, but it's really important. There should be no element of this drawing that looks like an actual drawn outline. If you have to make sharp edges anywhere, that sharp edge needs to match the shadows or the dark areas that are around it. Now we'll go through one more level of refinement with this little archway where I'm just sharpening up the edges with a pencil, and then I'll blend those away and clean up the edges again with a Tombow eraser. I'm just making sure that the sides of this archway are as perfectly straight as I can get them. Now we'll jump into that balcony that I was talking about earlier and that railing. So I'm going to drop this in with the darkest of my hard charcoal, and I'm making kind of an outline here along the whole thing because this is going to have a darker interior, so the outline part isn't quite as important here. But all I did was make just 4 or 5 little vertical slash marks along there, and that's it. That's the balcony. And it's so simple to put in, but whenever we get the stuff drawn around it, this is suddenly going to pop out and look crazy detailed by comparison. Now I'll go through each one of these little posts and along the outside and just clean those up with that Tombow eraser again. And it's all about sharpening and making defined sharp edges. Yeah, so look at this whole thing as a whole. We did that a minute ago, but really look at how far we've come in just 20-30 minutes worth of tedious, meticulous little refinement. It all looked blobby at the first, and it still looks blobby in a lot of areas. But every bit of this is just about putting it in and refining, then refining some more and more and more. It's all about building layers, and it's about correcting things as we go along. We'll actually put even more detail into this as we go, and those poles will become more apparent and more defined and sharp. The shadows will get darker. At the very end of the drawing, I'll actually go over every shadow that's prominent with charcoal powder and a paintbrush. Then we're going to darken these up, and it will make this building pop out and become crazy 3D whenever we add those in. But I'm not worried about doing that now. All I'm worried about is adding in the base layers and these basic shapes and basic tones, just so that I know that the shapes are correct, and then I'll worry about refining those and making them more 3D later down the line. If that's my process. If your process is to get every single detail correct right out of the gates before moving on to something else, there's nothing saying you can't do that. If that's the way you work and it produces a really nice realistic drawing, absolutely do that. But for me, I found that it's better to come back to areas later and refine those as I go. So now with the darker of my hard charcoal, and if you don't have one that makes marks like this, use a medium pencil. I'm going to start throwing in some more detail along that balcony and that railing, and I'm again just making tiny little vertical slash marks, and those represent background shadows. The negative space represents the poles that holds the railing up. Now I'll just kind of touch and pull very, very lightly over each of those pencil marks in order to remove pencil stroke marks and make that a little bit fuzzier. And that just makes it look a little less drawn and a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit more real. I'll go back over the railing itself with a Tombow eraser to take out any overlaps and make that really bright white. And then I'll sharpen the edges of that with, I don't know if that's a B or an H pencil, but it doesn't matter. As long as you're using a light touch, just sharpening those edges enough to where the stroke marks match the shadows behind it. Anytime you see me touching the paper like that, by the way, I'm not smearing the pencil with my fingers. I don't like drawing and using my finger as a blending stump, which is the way a lot of charcoal artists do it. I don't. Anytime you see me touching the paper like that, I'm removing eraser shreds, little eraser crumbs. So now I'm going to go back in with a B pencil, and we're going to do, again, more of the same. I'm going to start adding in little decorative stripes and little shadows that happen below the balcony and stuff like that. And I'm just using a light touch, making sure that my strokes are parallel to the rail, making sure that they're nice and flat and straight. And then I'll blend those away with a blending stump or blend those into each other and take out pencil marks. And then clean it up with a Tombow. Same exact process we've been doing this entire time. Now, while I've got that in my hand, what I'm going to do is pull down the little vertical slash marks that I've made earlier. And the only reason I'm doing that is I'm making them a little bit longer and making sure that that bottom row where those shadows stop, all stop parallel to the rail so that they're a little bit straighter. So all I did was just make a little bit of like dots there at the end of each one of those little vertical slash marks just to pull it down, straighten up that row, and make sure that it looks more man-made and that it's not wavy. Making sure that I don't accidentally get a diagonal line in there, and making sure it's all parallel and straight. So here's probably, I think, the most interesting part of this drawing, not from a detail perspective, but from one artist to another perspective. There is this decorative thing and right smack dab in the middle of this building. And it's like a sculpture. And I don't know what it is. It looks like a lion or, I don't know, something sitting on a throne or something. The reference photo was too small and didn't have enough detail for me to see exactly what it is, but it's this really artistic sculpted element. I don't want that to be a focal point. I want the top part of the building that lies above this, from that middle archway up. I want that to be the focal point. So what I'm going to do here is something that is intimidating and scary for an artist to try to pull off, but I think that's why I like to do it. I'm going to put so little detail into this decorative element that it forces it to not be a focal point. So what I'm going to do is I want to put in the main shadows, which are, there's a shadow that happens along the left-hand side of its face. There's little dots and swirls and stuff like that that happen along the middle and the bottom parts of it. But I am not going to put in so much detail into this that you can clearly see what it is. I only want this to look detailed because the brain is inferring detail by comparing it to other things. So people should, when this is all done, look at the top part of that dome, the middle section of that building, and they should basically see this little decorative element right in the middle out of like the corner of their eye. Because they would see it in that order, they're going to see detail in this little section when there actually isn't any detail. And in fact, it's one of the least detailed parts of this entire drawing. But I'm going to try to pull it off, and I think the end product does work. But it's also intimidating and a little bit scary, because if I get that wrong or I put too little detail into it, it can have the opposite effect. It could just make it look like I didn't know how to draw this section. And so I'm trying it anyway, and I did like it when it was done. The customer liked the whole piece when it was done. The framer he had some really, really good compliments about this drawing, and nobody mentioned the fact that this little middle section here could have used more detail or anything, because it becomes like a secondary element within the drawing. So I'm still putting care into it, because the shadows that I am putting in need to be in the right place. And they need to be roughly the same shapes that they are in the reference photo, but I'm eliminating a ton of mid-tone gray. I'm eliminating a ton of tiny little dots and swoops and stuff like that that would define this and make this element extremely detailed. But it's a bit of an experiment. I'm not sure that I would suggest to a beginning artist to try this technique out, because it can ruin the drawing if you mess it up. Now the way that I'm going to pull this off is I'm going to do these shadows, and I'm going to get the main ones in place. Then I'm going to come back to it with a blending stump, and all the mid-tone grays that I put in here are going to be done with a stump. Then if I need to highlight anything, I can do that with a Tombow eraser. But I'm also looking at every shadow that appears on this little sculpture type thing, and I'm picking out which ones to put, or which ones to draw, and which ones to eliminate. But I can't really teach you how to do that. This comes from your own artistic eye. And it's a decision-making element that you have to decide yourself as an artist. They call it artistic license, I guess, is what I'm doing here, is using my artistic license. Now, if we zoomed in on the building, and the only thing I was drawing was just that middle section, and then let the wings trail off on the sides of the paper, I would go into extreme detail here and match the sculpture up exactly the way it appears in the reference photo. But it's kind of what artistic license is about. If you want this to be an actual focal point of the drawing, then I would suggest spending a couple hours on this section and making sure that every single last detail is in place. But there's a trade-off. If that becomes the focal point, then that middle section, the top middle section of this building, will become a secondary feature. So you have to kind of think about the trade-off on that. Okay, so now we just take a blending stump and start blending out the pencil marks that I've made, and then pulling those pencil marks into the bulk of that sculpture. So we're moving around charcoal, we're moving it around on the paper in order to fill out our grays, our darker grays and our mid-tone grays. All right, so I'm going to slow it down here. We're inside this little triangle roof area, and there is a lot of decorative elements going on in here. The first part of this has like these decorative bricks that are thrown in, and they're just little squares that happen every once in a while underneath the main part of the stripy part of the roof. And you'll start to see what I mean here in just a bit as I fill this in. So I'm going to fill this in with hard charcoal or a medium pencil if, again, I'm not going to explain the hard charcoal thing again because that's going to get repetitive. But either a dark hard charcoal or a regular medium pencil will do the same thing here. So I'm filling in the background area behind those decorative bricks with that hard charcoal and leaving the bricks as negative space. Then when I blend all this in a little bit later, the only thing I have to do to make these bricks look square is to reshape them with a Tombow eraser and erase away any overlaps that I've got. So I'm being a little careful and trying to maintain the best rectangular shapes I can in this area, but I'm not super concentrating on it. Like, I'm not going to go way out of my way to make sure the negative space is perfect, because I know I can do the same thing with a Tombow eraser. So I want to throw those in, and then I want to use the same concept to fill in the middle part of this this little roof triangular area. It's got another thing that's like the sculpture above it. It's like a sculptured, carved out, decorative thing. And again, I don't know what it is. The details are too small in the reference photo for me to tell what that is. But again, I can cheat my way around it by not putting in a ton of detail. I'm just focusing on the main shadows here and doing it the same way as I did the sculpture above it. And in doing that, it's going to become like a secondary feature that people aren't going to really be drawn to. They'll still see it's there because, again, they're seeing the building as a whole and they know that this area has got detail in it, but they're not going to really stop and focus on it, at least not at first. Now, the biggest thing that I concentrate on whenever I'm blending this stuff together is taking the pencil marks out first. And then we can get into adding the gray areas second. But the main part of this is I want to take out the pencil marks without losing a lot of the edges that I just threw in there. So in other words, if I just took a blending stump and blended over the face of this entire thing, yes, it's going to take out the pencil marks and add in the gray area, but it's going to make the edges of these shadows blur. And I don't want to add blur to this section because the areas around it are not blurred. So we're going to work on this area down below. I sped through the outline because it's just an outline. But what I'm going to do is take extra soft charcoal here, and I'm very lightly scrubbing in some dark areas, and I'm not really worried about leaving pinholes here. I just want the darkness part of this to be in here, and it doesn't need to be jet black. So I'm going to throw all that in with a really light touch with extra soft charcoal. Now watch what happens whenever I use the blending stump. Look how dark that is compared to the stuff that I threw in with pencil. That's happening because the blending stump is filling in the pinholes that poke out in those scrub marks. The little teeth of the paper and stuff is being filled in with charcoal now because we're moving the charcoal around on this section of the page. So the other thing is I'm trying to stay in the lines, but it's not totally necessary because anything that goes outside the lines here is going to be made by a blending stump. It's also incredibly easy to erase with any type of eraser. So I'm going to do the same thing here that I did on all the rest of the drawing. I'm going to blend away the pencil marks, I'm going to blend away the pinholes, and then I'm going to clean it up with a Tombow eraser. And this is just the very first layer of black and gray and stuff that happens inside this central main archway. We're also going to go over this several times because we're going to need to darken it up a little bit at a time each time we pass through it. We're going to spend a little bit of extra time on this one as compared to the other doorways because this one, no matter what we do, it's going to be an eye catcher. People are automatically going to look there because they're used to looking into in real life, like looking into the front door of a building. And so no matter what we did with this, people's eyes are going to go right to it. So we might as well put a ton of detail into it, or at least take our time and make sure that every little thing is correct. So after I blend this all together, I'm going to clean up some edges and start sharpening these up. Even the silhouettes that I put in the middle there, I'm going to make sure that the shapes and everything are right on the money. And I'm not going to do what I did to the areas above it, which is, when we remove detail in order to create, in order to force people's eyes to go where we want them to go. In this one, we don't have much control of that. Their eyes are going to go to it. We might as well spend the time to do it right and put in detail even though we may not want to. So secondary layer of refinement, I want to start darkening up little strips of shadow that happen on the upper side of this archway. And I'm using extra soft charcoal in this area, I'm pretty sure. If not, I'm using the darker of my hard charcoal. But the main idea is that we're adding another layer of blackness to this area. Whatever pencil makes that work for you, use that pencil. Now remember, whenever we do layers of blending and layers of pencil like this on top of each other over and over, you need to have a light touch, because if you push too hard with either of those things, it's eventually going to burnish the paper, which means it's going to shred the paper into these loose fibers, and it's going to destroy your drawing. So make sure that you're using kind of a light touch. Also, if your paper is just a poorer quality paper and it shreds easily, then you're either going to have to get better paper, or you're going to have to figure out a way personally to get around it. Because the paper I use, it's Strathmore 400 series, and it's a medium weight paper. It actually takes quite a bit to shred my paper. But I have a different style on a different size that if I tried this same method, it would just shred it like crazy. So I can't use this method on a different style of paper or a different brand. So now I'm just adding a few more tiny details, which are parts of the ceiling and walls and stuff that catch a bit more shadow than the rest. I'm just laying those in lightly with extra soft charcoal, blending those out with a blending stump, and that just gives it an extra layer of texture and breaking up that solid black mass. Makes it a little bit more interesting. So during this sped up section, all I'm doing is just the same thing I've done before. I'm defining a little bit of detail. I also threw in a little bit of outline work in order to give myself boundaries to work within. But nothing I'm doing here is any different than what I've shown in the rest of this drawing or in the first two videos. I want to slow down here just a bit because we're going to finish off this front archway section. And there is what I think is either a chandelier that comes down along this area, and also there is another archway in the back of the room on the other side of the building that kind of pokes through and gets broken up by details that lie in front of it. So I'm just dropping those in quickly and defining things like the giant chandelier that hangs down. I'm not putting in so much detail that we're drawing, light bulbs and candles and stuff like that. I'm accentuating the main details to show that there's a curve in the background. That curve is kind of sharpened and whatnot. Now there is one detail in here that I did not know existed until the entire drawing was done. And that is, I think there's a wedding going on in here. So right now all I'm looking at is the shadows in the reference photo. And I'm trying to replicate those. When I get done with this all the way, I believe there's a bride standing on the left and a groom standing on the right with the best man standing next to him. And there's barely any detail there at all because it's so far away, but I think that's what's going on. And I really hope that the person who I drew this for doesn't notice it for a long time. I hope he doesn't know it exists within this photo, and I hope it's like a year or two down the line, he gets to looking at it really close and is like, holy crap, there's a wedding going on in there. I never noticed it. because I think it would be a nice surprise and it would be kind of neat to discover an Easter egg like that. But again, since I'm focusing on details that are so small and I'm just focusing on shapes that are so precise, I'm only looking at just a couple centimeters of this section, and I don't see it as here's a person and another person facing each other. I see it as here's a triangular shadow, here's a hyphen, here's a dash, and here's a circle, and I'm just drawing those. Here's a shade of gray that's slightly less dark than this other section. That's all I'm seeing in this area. But it's always a cool surprise to see that at the end of a drawing, that there are things in the drawing that I never knew existed while I was doing the actual work. Alright, so now all this is just refinement. So we're going to just kind of take the blending stump and start throwing in same things we've been doing, shadows here, refining little pieces of darkness there. And then once we get that basic stuff laid in and a little bit of refinement thrown in, we're going to start working on these poles. I'm going to slow down for this because this is one of the main features of the drawing. And I made this part rough on purpose for the same reason that I made the sculpture stuff rough. So it's a main feature of the drawing in that these poles have stripes that go across them, and it's basically cracks within the masonry, almost like you've stacked cinder blocks on top of each other, and then that little mortar section in between them creates those cracks. It's basically kind of like that. I could have measured out every single one of those stripes, and I could have gotten them exact and used a straight edge and all that. But again, I'm working in that style that I call dirty realism, and I want this to be hand drawn. So it is going to be a bit off. The lines are going to be not exactly parallel, but I want these to be hand drawn all the way across and try to make them as perfect as I can without spending 10 hours, to do it. So anyway, I'm drawing the pole the same way I drew the ones on top. I've thrown in the background shadow first that happens on the outside of the pole, and that is the shadow that falls across the face of the building. I've left the pole itself as negative space for now, but I will go back into that eventually and put a secondary shadow on the face of the pole on the left-hand side. It'll be light compared to the shadows behind it. So I'm starting to get into these little stripes that happen, and I'm just doing that really light with a hard charcoal. And let's skip ahead a little bit here because I'm going to be doing a lot more of what we've already gone over. I'm just throwing in details like the door, takes no effort at all. Throwing in details like shadows here and there. Now let's slow down when we get to these little lines. So there are about 14 or 15 of these lines that happen across the pole. And basically I need to do a little bit of guesswork and eyeball work in order to get these as evenly spaced as I can. So once I have those in place, and that's just, you have to have a good eye to do it. Once I have those in place, I'm just going to darken those up a little bit. And I think, I can't swear to this, I think I may actually get these a little bit wrong whenever I first do it, and I have to go back in with a thicker, more hardcore eraser and take those out and redo them. But the technique that I'm using here is going to be the same technique that I use on the whole face of this building. I'm basically trying to draw parallel lines, and then I will refine those to make them look a little bit straighter and a little bit more even. And then as I get closer to them being correct, I'll go through and darken them and even them up even more with a hard charcoal pencil. Because in the end, these things are going to need to be defined. Now, the hard part, I mean, this is hard on its own, but the harder part is that there are several layers of this building. There are probably somewhere between 6 and 8 different levels of depth within the front of this building. So there's like a pole here and a recess there and another section of the building that's 5 or 6 feet further into the distance, and they all stack on top of each other. So every time I make a new layer of building that is in a recess or a protrusion, I have to slightly skew these lines from each other. So basically, whenever I have the next section come up, the lines will not be perfectly connecting. They'll be like a quarter of a millimeter, maybe half a millimeter offset from each other to show that there's a new layer of building there. The shadows will help define that, but if I go all the way across and connect those lines perfectly straight, it'll look like I just drew a straight line through the front of the building and suddenly the whole thing becomes flat. So like right here, this is a recess within the building, and I know it's difficult to tell on video, but this is slightly skewed from the lines that are beside it. It'll become a little bit more apparent whenever I get the shadow put in place, but this, I think, was more difficult than any part of the drawing, was getting these lines correct. Now, the compressed version that you're going to see on your phone or a computer screen or a laptop or whatever, these lines are going to look more squiggly than they look in real life, because the real life version is 18 inches by 24 inches, and since the page is way bigger than what you're going to see on screen, those little imperfections are still there, obviously, but they're not nearly as noticeable because it's bigger. And so whenever you compress something like this down, it tends to accentuate flaws in an area that's like this. Now the same thing here. I think this is another recession because it's buried deeper in shadow, and so the skewed lines are going to be way more skewed than the ones that are even in front of them, because the perspective is going to push that back and offset the lines even more. So I'm drawing that more skewed, and in deeper shadow, and giving it a slightly darker line, because these shadows within the cracks are going to be even darker because they're buried in yet another shadow. So I'm going to throw those in, get them settled, and then move on to the next part. And then I'm going to continue this process through the entire face of the building. So once we have this part down and you can see what I'm doing, I'm going to be flying through the rest of the drawing in fast motion so that we're not sitting here and watching me do this for a couple of hours. If I hadn't mentioned it already, what you're seeing in this video is 14 hours worth of drawing. I think maybe even further than that. It may be closer to 15 hours of drawing that we're editing down and compressing into basically an hour to an hour and a half long video by the time it's all edited. So yes, it does take a lot of patience, because the drawing itself in total took 25 hours, and that's with 40 years of practice for me. So the average artist, I mean, a drawing like this could take you, I don't know, 40, 50, 60 hours. I mean, I know some people it would take them 100, 200 hours or more. I get that a lot. People will look at my drawings and say that would have taken me a month to do. But that's just, practice. Over time, you get faster with it. So 25 hours may seem like a lot of time to some artists, but to me it's not even close to the most time I've spent on a drawing. I have a drawing that I have for sale, but it's going to take too much money to sell it because I put so much time into it. But anyway, it took 120 hours to draw that one particular drawing. If you follow me on Patreon, I'll talk more about stuff like that, or follow me on Twitter. All that stuff I think is in my About section here on YouTube. You can find all kinds of places to discuss stuff like this with me. But if you want to know stuff like that, I've always got that stuff pulled up on the computer or my phone. I'm easily contactable. All right, so here's another layer of these little lines, and this one is closer to the camera than the layer that's to its right. So these are offset, but they're offset slightly above the background lines. Again, I'm using a very light touch, and if we need to darken them later, we can. It's better to start light and then darken as a correction than to start too dark and have to lighten as a correction. It's always better to add charcoal, or easier to add charcoal than it is to remove charcoal. So we've already shown how to do the windows and all that stuff. So we're going to blow through this, and all we're doing is refining. Adding in the same things we added above. If you want to see how to do that stripe, that's in the first video. All these decorative elements, these are all covered before, so we're going to blow through this. Now I just want to slow down to show you how to separate out this pole from the background. So we did just what we were doing before, adding in, our stripes and stuff like that. But now we're going to start defining the shadows right on top of those stripes. It's not going to kill the detail of the stripes by adding the shadows on top of it. And even if it does, you can always go back and define those with a pencil later. But we need to be able to define this little post or this column because it's going to be a point of interest, and because if we don't start defining stuff like that, all of this stuff on bottom is just going to kind of blend together in this weird, confusing mass. So all I'm doing to pull that off is grabbing a blending stump and just adding in some shadows, and then we'll start to refine and define these shadows here in just a few. So right here I'm using a hard charcoal pencil, and I'm just very lightly throwing in a hard edge shadow along the left hand side of that pole, and what I'm not doing is drawing an outline. and I'll get a lot of extra soft charcoal on the blending stump itself so that we have a mark that's not only darker, but it's blacker. It's darker in tone and in shade. And we're just adding in an extra strip there in order to make that stand out. So we'll do it again in this little recessed section over here. We're adding blacker and darker charcoal to this little recessed section in order to push it back into the background. And then by the same right, it'll take those other parts and push them forward that surround it. We'll define that even more a little bit later. So we'll go up into the window, and there's a shadow that falls across it. We want to darken and define the shadow that goes across that. And the same thing with these little extra bumpy sections that happen to the right of that. We'll define those as well. Now here's one of the most prominent shadows on the whole building, or at least on the face of the building. It's a very dark, almost pitch black shadow that happens between two columns. So I'm taking extra soft charcoal and putting a thin strip of black right here, but I'm not using a lot of pressure. You can see how it's clumpy and has pinholes in everything, or scattered all throughout it. I'm going to get rid of those with a blending stump because even though it's very dark, it's not so jet black that it's jarring. That's why I'm using a light touch and letting the blending stump do the rest of the work. If I decided that I wanted to go darker than this, then all I have to do is go over that with extra soft charcoal again and again blend it and keep doing that until it's the level I want it. I want it to be really dark, but I don't want to go overboard with it. So we're going to blow through this because we're now doing the second half of the building exactly the same way we did to the left half of the building. The right half is we're just repeating the process of what I've already taught you. So the rest of this is going to be blowing through this at time-lapse speed. And actually this is real time. I just drank a lot of coffee. We're going to blow through the right-hand section, the right-hand wing, and then we're going to slow it down here in a minute so I can show you how to do the pavement. Because this is all stuff that I showed you in the first video when I did the first wing. Then once we get this main landscape down, and these stairs, by the way, all I did was I shaded that in with a blending stump or a Q-tip and then just literally drew straight lines across it super thin to make the illusion of stairs. So here's where we're going to slow down, and to make pavement, to make this concrete, all I've done is put extra soft charcoal on a Q-tip, and then very lightly I'm just scrubbing horizontally across the page in a very, very light touch. And it's okay if this is clumpy and dirty because a lot of pavement is clumpy and dirty. There's going to be dark spots where people have leaked oil from their car, or just there's going to be walking strips where people have over time walked in the same area for so long it creates light or dark spots. And so it's okay if this is clumpy. I'm going to try not to make the entire thing crazy clumpy, but it's okay if they appear every once in a while. So I'm going to do this all the way across, and the only thing that I'm keeping in mind here is I'm kind of making the right-hand side of this darker than the sides of this darker than the middle. So I throw that in with a Q-tip, and then I'm going to go back with a paper towel and put a little bit of extra soft charcoal on it, not a ton, and then lightly I'm just going to scrub across that entire thing. This is where your paper matters. If you have the paper I was talking about earlier that's cheap and it burnishes easy, this is going to tear the living crap out of your paper. But this type that I use can handle this. But I'm very lightly just wiping it down the way you'd wipe down a countertop and smoothing out all those little Q-tip scrub marks I had earlier. Notice as I get toward the building, I'm not touching that because I don't want to destroy the detail that I have in the stairs or the landscape. We can always go back in with a Q-tip or a blending stump and fill in that white area in a minute, which I think I do here. Yeah, I just load up a Q-tip with some extra soft charcoal, not too black, you just want it just a little bit dirty. And then we're just going to fill in those blank spots that I couldn't get with a paper towel. And then the only thing left with this drawing here in just a minute is to put in the details of the pavement, which is this, there's a crack that runs right down the middle. And that crack is actually a kind of a focal point in itself because it's so perfectly centered in the middle of the drawing. So I'm just going to throw that there, and the crack gets lighter as it gets toward closer to the building, and it gets darker as it gets closer to the camera. It's also not a completely solid crack. There's like a little, it's not a hole in the middle of it, but there's like a rain drain or something in the middle that breaks that up. So I just throw that in, almost kind of like a yin yang sort of deal, where it's dark on one side and then it's light on the other. I just kind of mimic that in the drawing. You see me erasing away the white part on the left hand side, but drawing in the the dark spot on the right hand side. Here's my favorite part of the drawing: charcoal powder and a paintbrush. All we're going to do is put a little bit of charcoal powder on the paintbrush, and I am going to go over every prominent shadow on the entire face of this building. Now it looks really, really dark, what I'm doing here, and there's a bit of a buildup of charcoal powder in this section. That stuff is loose enough that I can blow it off, or as I get less and less charcoal on the paintbrush, as it removes charcoal from the paintbrush, then I can bring that back in whenever it's all clean and thin that out a little bit. So I'm just using a light touch and darkening up every prominent shadow on the whole building, and watch how dramatically this changes from a really, it's not entirely 2D looking right now, but it looks more 2D than it needs to. But watch how much this changes it into a 3D object once I start darkening up all these shadows. I'll just sit back and let you watch this because it's my favorite part of the whole thing. All right, so as we're finishing this up, I just wanted to thank you guys again for supporting me here on YouTube and on Patreon. And if you, again, as always, if you know people who are into this sort of thing, please pass my YouTube along, the Patreon along. We're trying to build up our numbers a little bit, and they are slowly growing, but we're also hitting a stagnation, so I kind of want to get over a hump. So we're going to wrap this up. I hope you like this this video, and I hope you learned something from it. And if you have any suggestions on how I can improve these, I'm always up for suggestions. So hit me in the comments, hit me on Patreon, hit me on Twitter or wherever. I'm always around, and I'm always open for it. Thank you so much again, and we'll see you in the next video.